number 19 in the Lullaby Course Series, A Course in Miracles, Original Edition, Chapter 7, Section 9. The Defense of Conflict. We have once said that without projection there can be no anger, but it's also true that without projection there can be no love. Projection is a fundamental law of the mind, and therefore a law which always operates. Projection is the law by which you create and were created. Projection is the law which unifies creation and keeps creation in the mind of God. To the ego, the law of projection is perceived as a way of getting rid of something it doesn't want. To the Holy Spirit, projection is the fundamental law of sharing, by which you give what you value in order to keep it in your own mind. Projection to the Holy Spirit is the law of extension. To the ego, projection is the law of deprivation. Projection, therefore, produces abundance or scarcity depending on how you choose to apply projection. This choice of how you choose to apply projection is up to you. But it's not up to you to decide whether or not you will utilize projection. Every mind must project, because that is how every mind lives, and every mind is life. The ego's use of projection must be fully understood before projection's inevitable association between projection and anger can be finally undone. The ego's use of projection must be fully understood before its inevitable association between projection and anger can be finally undone. The ego always tries to preserve conflict. The ego always tries to preserve conflict. The ego is very ingenious in devising ways which seem to diminish conflict, because the ego doesn't want you to find conflict so intolerable that you will insist on giving it up. Therefore, the ego tries to persuade you that it can free you of conflict, lest you give the ego up and free yourself. The ego, using its own warped version of the laws of God, utilizes the power of the mind only to defeat the mind's real purpose. The ego, using its own warped version of the laws of God, utilizes the power of the mind only to defeat the mind's real purpose. The ego projects conflict from your mind to other minds in an attempt to persuade you that you have gotten rid of conflict. The ego trying to persuade you that you've gotten rid of conflict by projecting conflict from your mind to other minds. This has several fallacies which may not be so apparent. Strictly speaking, conflict cannot be projected precisely because conflict cannot be fully shared. Any attempt to keep part of conflict and get rid of another part of conflict does not really mean anything. Remember that a conflicted teacher is a poor teacher and a poor learner. A conflicted teacher's lessons are confused, and their transfer value is severely limited by this poor teacher's confusion. A second fallacy is the idea that you can get rid of something you don't want by giving it away. Giving it is how you keep it. The belief that by giving it out, you have excluded it from within is a complete distortion of the power of extension. That is why those who project from the ego are vigilant for their own safety. Those who project from the ego are vigilant for their own safety because they are afraid that their projections will return and hurt them. These who project from their ego, they do believe they have blotted out their projections from their own minds, but they also believe their projections are trying to creep back into their minds. And those who attack and project their ego out in trying to get rid of what they don't want within their own selves, but also believing that their projections are trying to creep back into their minds, is because the projections have not left their minds. And this in turn forces these folks to engage in compulsive activity in order not to recognize that their projections have not left their minds. You cannot perpetuate an illusion about another without perpetuating it about yourself. And there is no way out of this, because it is impossible to fragment the mind. When you project your conflict out and see it in other minds, believing that you've gotten rid of that aspect of yourself that you don't want, you will always believe that what you're seeing in somebody else, but not yourself, you'll always believe that those projections are trying to creep back into you, and you will become vigilant for your own safety. But what you see in other people and don't like, not realizing that you have projected that which you don't like onto them. And having the experience that everything you've projected out is trying to creep back into your own mind forces you to engage in compulsive activity in order not to recognize that it hasn't left your mind. To fragment is to break into pieces. And mind cannot attack or be attacked. Mind cannot be fragmented. The belief that mind can be fragmented or attacked is a fallacy which the ego always makes. And this lie, which the ego always makes, underlies the ego's whole use of projection. The belief that the mind can be fragmented, that what is in my mind can be projected out and gotten rid of and seen in another mind. That is the lie the ego always makes, and that is the lie that underlies the ego's whole use of projection. See, the ego doesn't understand what mind is, and so the ego therefore doesn't understand what you are. Yet the ego's existence is dependent on your mind, because the ego is your belief. The ego is therefore a confusion in identification, which never had a consistent model and never developed consistently. The ego never had a consistent model, and the ego never developed consistently. The ego is the distorted product of the misapplication of the laws of God by distorted minds which are misusing their own power. The ego is the distorted product of the misapplication of the laws of God by distorted minds which are misusing their own power. But do not be afraid of the ego. Do not be afraid of the ego. Do not be afraid of the ego, because the ego does depend on your mind. And as you made the ego by believing in the ego, so you can dispel the ego by withdrawing belief from the ego. Do not project the responsibility for your belief in your ego onto anyone else, or you will preserve your ego. Do not project the responsibility for your belief in the ego onto anyone else, or you will preserve your ego. When you are willing to accept sole responsibility for the ego's existence yourself, you will have laid aside all anger, and you will have laid aside all attack, because all anger and all attack come from an attempt to project responsibility for your own errors. But having accepted the errors as yours, do not keep these errors. But having accepted the ego as yours, do not keep the ego. Give your ego and all its errors over quickly to your loving right mind, to be undone completely, so that all your ego's effects will vanish from your mind and from the family of God entirely as a whole. The Holy Spirit, the shared inspiration of all, will teach you to perceive beyond belief, because truth is beyond belief. And Holy Spirit's perception is true. The ego can be completely forgotten at any time, because the ego always was a belief that is totally incredible. No one can keep a belief he has judged to be unbelievable. And so the more you learn about the ego, the more you realize that the ego cannot be believed. The incredible cannot be understood because it is unbelievable. The utter meaninglessness of all perception that comes from the unbelievable must be apparent. But it's not recognized as beyond belief because it was made by belief. The whole purpose of this course is to teach you that the ego is unbelievable and will forever be unbelievable. You who made the ego by believing the unbelievable cannot make this judgment alone. By accepting the Course in Miracles for yourself, you are deciding against the belief that you can be alone, thus dispelling the idea of separation and affirming your true identification with the whole of creation as literally part of you. And your identification with all of creation as part of you, this identification is as beyond doubt as it is beyond belief. Your wholeness has no limits because being is in infinity. The whole purpose of this course is to teach you that the ego is unbelievable and will forever be unbelievable. But you who made the ego by believing the unbelievable can't make this judgment yourself alone. And so as you accept the atonement or the Course in Miracles principles for yourself, then you're deciding against the belief in the ego and dispelling the ego and affirming your true identification with all of creation. Section 10, Chapter 7, the extension of the kingdom. Only you can limit your creative power, but God wills to release your creative power. God no more wills you to deprive yourself of your creations than God wills you to deprive Himself of His creations. Do not withhold your gifts to the family of God, or you will withhold yourself from God. Selfishness is of the ego, but self-fullness is of the soul, because self-fullness is how God created the soul. Your loving right mind, the Holy Spirit, is the part of the mind that lies between the ego and the soul, mediating between them always. Mediating between your ego and your soul, always in favor of the soul. To the ego, this is partiality, and the ego therefore responds as if it were the part that is being sided against. The ego always responds as if it were being sided against. And you, who identify with the ego, respond as if you are being sided against. To the soul, this is truth, because the soul knows its fullness and cannot conceive of any part from which it is excluded. The soul knows that the consciousness of all its brothers is included in its own consciousness, just like the soul knows that it is included in God. The power of the whole family of God and its Creator is therefore the soul's own fullness, rendering the soul's creations equally whole and equal in perfection. Equally whole means equal in perfection. The ego cannot prevail against a totality which includes God. And any totality must include God. Everything God created is given all of God's power, because everything that God created is part of God and shares God's being with Him. Creating is the opposite of loss. Just like blessing is the opposite of sacrifice. Being must be extended. That is how being retains the knowledge of itself. The soul yearns to share its being as its creator did. Created by sharing, the soul's will is to create. The soul does not wish to contain God. The soul just wishes to extend God's being. The extension of God's being is the soul's only function. The soul's fullness cannot be contained any more than can the fullness of its creator. Fullness is extension. The ego's whole thought system blocks extension. And so the ego's whole thought system thus blocks your only function. And so the ego's whole thought system therefore blocks your joy. And that is why you see yourself as unfulfilled. Unless you create, unless you extend as you were extended, you are unfulfilled. But God doesn't know of unfulfillment, and therefore you must extend. You must create. You may not know your own extensions. You may not know your own creations. But just because you don't know your own creations and your own extensions can no more interfere with their reality than your unawareness of your soul can interfere with its being. Creation is forever extending because it is in the mind of God. You do not know your joy because you do not know your own self-fullness. You don't know your own self-fullness as long as you exclude any part of creation from yourself. And if you exclude any part of creation from yourself, then you won't know that you are whole. A split mind cannot perceive its fullness. And so a split mind needs the miracle of its wholeness to dawn upon it and to heal it. A split mind cannot perceive its fullness. And so a split mind needs the miracle of its wholeness to dawn upon it and heal it. And when the miracle of your mind's wholeness dawns upon your mind and heals your mind, this reawakens the wholeness in your mind and restores your mind to creation because of your mind's acceptance of wholeness. The full appreciation of your mind's self-fullness makes selfishness impossible and extension inevitable. The full appreciation of your mind's self-fullness makes selfishness impossible and extension inevitable. That is why there is perfect peace in reality, in creation, in the kingdom. And the reason there is perfect peace in the kingdom, in creation, in reality, is because every soul is fulfilling its function. And only complete fulfillment is peace. Insanity appears to add reality, but no one would claim that what insanity adds is true. Insanity is therefore the non-extension of truth, which blocks joy, because it blocks creation and thus blocks self-fulfillment. The unfulfilled must be depressed, because their self-fullness is unknown to them. Your creations are protected for you because the Holy Spirit who is in your mind knows of your extensions and can bring them into your awareness whenever you will let Him. So Holy Spirit, I ask you and allow you to bring my creations and my extensions into my awareness, so that I may know my own self-fullness and therefore not block my extensions or block my joy. My extensions, my creations, they are there in me, in my mind, as a part of my own being, because my fulfillment includes them. Your creations, your extensions they are part of your own being, because your fulfillment includes them. The creations of every soul of God are yours, since every creation belongs to everyone, being created for the family of God as a whole. You have not failed to add to the inheritance of the children of God, and you have thus not failed to secure your inheritance for yourselves. If it was the will of God to give your inheritance to you, then God gave your inheritance to you forever. It was God's will that you have your inheritance forever. And so God gave you the means for keeping your inheritance, and you have kept your inheritance. Disobeying God's will is meaningful only to the insane. Disobeying God's will that you have your inheritance, that is meaningful only to the insane. In truth, it's impossible to disobey God's will for you to have your inheritance. And that's because your self-fullness is as boundless as God's. Like God's, your self-fullness extends forever and in perfect peace. Your self-fullness's radiance is so intense that it creates in perfect joy, and only the whole can be born of its wholeness. Be confident that you have never lost your identity. And be confident that the extensions which maintain your identity in wholeness and in peace, you have not lost. Be confident. Miracles are an expression of this confidence, that you've never lost your identity or the extensions which maintain your identity. Miracles are reflections both of your own proper identification with your brothers and also your proper identification with your own awareness that your identification is maintained by extension. In other words, the miracle is a lesson in total perception, seeing wholeness, you as part of the whole and the whole as part of you, wholeness. By including any part of totality in the lesson, you have included the whole. You have said that when you write of the kingdom and your creations which belong to it, you are describing what you do not know. That is true in a sense, but no more true than your failure to acknowledge the whole result of the ego's premises. The kingdom or creation is the result of premises, just as the world is. You have carried the ego's reasoning to its logical conclusion, you have carried the ego's reasoning to its logical confusion, which is total confusion about everything. The ego's logical conclusion, total confusion about everything. You don't really believe that the logical conclusion of the ego is total confusion about everything, or else you couldn't possibly maintain your ego. If you really saw this result of total confusion about everything, which is the ego's logical conclusion, then you could not want the ego. The only reason why you could possibly want any part of the ego is because you don't see the whole of the ego. You don't see that if you follow the ego's reasoning to its logical confusion, it leads to total confusion about everything. You are willing to look at the ego's premises, but not at the ego's logical outcome. Is it not possible that you have done this same thing with the premises of God? Your creations are the logical outcome of God's premises. God's thinking has established these outcomes for you. God's thinking has established these logical outcomes for you. These logical outcomes that come from God's thinking are therefore exactly where they belong. And the logical conclusions of God's thinking belong in your mind as part of your identification with God's mind. But your state of mind and your recognition of what is in your mind depends at any given moment on what you believe about your mind. Your state of mind, which is your recognition of what is in your mind, depends at any given moment on what you believe about your mind. It is surely clear that you can both accept into your mind what is not really there, and it is surely clear that you can also deny what is in your mind. But neither of these possibilities requires further elaboration here, but both are clearly indefensible, even if you elect to defend them. Yet the function which God Himself gave your minds through His mind, you may deny, but you can't prevent. The function which God Himself gave your mind, it's just the logical conclusion of what you are. It's the logical outcome of what you are. But the ability to see a logical outcome depends on the willingness to see it. But its truth has nothing to do with your willingness at all. Truth is God's will. And so if you share God's will, then you share what God knows. If you deny God's will as your will, then you are denying God's reality and yours. The Holy Spirit will direct you only so as to avoid pain. The undoing of pain must obviously avoid pain. Surely no one would object to avoiding pain if they recognized the goal was avoiding pain. The problem is not whether what the Holy Spirit says is true, but whether you want to listen to what Holy Spirit says.